Hey guys, on the next identification unit where we're going to cover the nocturnal birds of prey, the owls, it'll be often that I'm going to be referring to size of them, and size is a very important feature to keep track of in regard to separating the different species. And I will frequent enough, I will say things like, this is a big owl, this is a medium-sized owl, and this is a small owl. This is a great horned owl. That's a large owl. Barred owls are quite large also. This is a medium-sized owl. This is a lanyard owl. It's about crow-sized. And then small owls, you have two of them on your list. We'll have screech owls and or screech owl, and you'll also have a northern saw-whet owl. So small, medium, large, so you can relate contextually, relatively speaking, to the size. Also, besides size, there's several other things you should always keep track of when it comes to owls. What's the eye color, the iris? In most of the owls you have, in fact, I believe the majority of owls in the world, are yellow, very common. You're going to have two brown-eyed owls. You're going to have the barred owl, and you will have the barn owl, who is also brown-eyed, but most of them will be yellow. You also should always pay attention to what's the bill color. Barred owls have light colored bills, off-white to yellow. Screech owl has a yellowish beak or an off-white bill. And then most of the owls are going to have dark brown or black bills. Another thing you should always keep track of when it comes to owls are feather tufts. Generally speaking, and there are several exceptions, forest owls tend to have feather tufts. And the feather tufts have several functions, one of which is they are used for display purposes, they are used during courtship antics. They are also used for camouflage. So when an owl wants to remain cryptic / hidden from view, they sleek their body up, they bring their plumage in, and these feather tufts go straight up. They close their eyes, they slit their eyes so you can't see them, because round objects like that stand out, or these round structures, if you will, stand out quite well. So, eye color, bill color, feather tufts, which typically occur in forest owls. There are some exceptions. Barred owls are forest owls, but they don't have feather tufts. Feather tufts typically don't occur in open nesting birds, owls, like the burrowing owl or the snowy owl, for instance. So, size, eye color, bill color, and feather tufts. Those are features you should always ask yourself when you get a glimpse of an owl, or when you're looking at the slides or some of the mounts I'll use, if those things are there or if they are absent. The owls, of course, are in the order Strigiformes, and there are two families, Ptidonidae, made up of and comprised of about a couple of dozen species, and the remaining are in the family Strigidae. And I will reiterate some of the taxonomy that you guys are responsible for. In fact, it bears repeating right now. Let's scale up and come back to where the comments I just made. We are in the kingdom Animalia. We are in the phylum Chordata. We are in class Aves. We are in order Strigiformes, and we are in, and we entertain two different families: the Ptidonidae, or Ptidonidae, or Ptidonidae. Either pronunciation is fine, and then Strigidae. There are about 220 species of owls recognized by taxonomy on the planet. For purposes of this class, we use the American Ornithologists Union for these common names and the categories of taxonomic ilk that I'm going to be using. Ptidonidae makes up about 25 species, and by far then therefore the Strigidae are without question the most speciose family of the nocturnal birds of prey. This particular order is not closely related to the daytime birds of prey, and they aren't closely related to the Cathartiformes. They are different, but they have evolved to occupy the nocturnal or the low light conditions as an analog, so to speak, to what the daytime birds of prey do, who of course are using diurnal facets. There are several opening remarks I also want to make besides the taxonomic themes I just mentioned, and that is to cast some features about owls in general. So, as is true of birds of prey around the world, birds of prey tend to be bigger than other birds. And I remind you, part of our task this semester is to separate birds of prey from other birds when we can, so that we remember how we distinguish, which is one of the goals and objectives of taxonomy, is to be able to separate and talk meaningfully about those entities that have specificity of designation of name. So, what we're looking at here is a great horned owl and a nestling. There is going to be, as is true of many birds of prey, some polymorphism or different colors depending upon often what are subspecies, a trinomial name. And so you'd have Bubo virginianus, for instance, and that third virginianus, or the second virginianus, means that there's a subspecies, which means this: it is a segment of the species or a population of the species that is adapted to local conditions. And this picture happens to be from prairie settings. There are scattered small woodlands. This horned owl is in a nest in an aspen tree. So, obviously, as is true of many birds of prey, generally speaking, compared to other birds, they're big. Owls come in a variety of colors, and it's something worth keeping track of as we move along. Owls have different posturing compared to the daytime birds of prey. And what you're looking at here is a fledgling great horned owl. And he's trying to threaten, make himself look bigger, which just about every organism that's threatened or is involved in an aggressive kind of dynamic will make itself bigger. So this bird has done that, and it's moved its feathers like this, the feathers of the forelimb, which is turned them over and shows you the top or the dorsal part of the feather. And the bird will rock back and forth, it'll snap its bill, and it'll hiss. Hissing isn't done by daytime birds of prey. There's a few exceptions, as always is the case. But daytime birds of prey turn their wings this way. And they also elevate their feathers, but this is a standard owl posture. And you'll rock back and forth, and you'll click their bill, and they will hiss. So this posturing helps separate from daytime birds of prey. This is a red-tailed hawk, and he's in a defensive posture also. And he has elevated all of his feathers. He has turned his wings, if you will, such that the ventral portion is to you. And of course, he's inflated his size as best he can. So this is a hallmark of a converse of posturing. Owls have special plumage that the daytime birds of prey do not have. And their feathers feel rather texturally like velvet, and they're very soft and smooth. And they also have on the leading or anterior edge, the fore part, the leading edge of the wing, has what are little frills that make up what in effect you can call as a comb-like or a comb component to these primary feathers, the most distal feathers of the forewing. And what this does, the texture is of course a structural construct of the feathers, and there's only really two orders of birds in which this occurs. It occurs in whippoorwills and nighthawks, they're the capromalgiformes, and then it occurs in strigiformes. And guess what? They are closely related birds in those two orders. What this tends to do is create some turbulence when the airfoil or the wing is moving through air, and it tends to muffle sound, such that owls and nighthawks have silent flight, which would be adapted for approaching their prey. So this is a very unique feature of their plumage. Here's a close-up of the comb, the construct of such on the same flight feathers I just showed you, to showing that fraying or frilled-like feature that allows the air to move through, and it tends to create turbulence and therefore soften, if you will, noise. Owls, of course, are dependent upon the use of hearing. During the evening, convection of air is minimized, so there's reduced sound. And of course, there's a liability to that. As you're approaching your prey, if you make noise, then you could be heard. Ergo, why the owls have the construct of the feathers I just mentioned. But detecting your prey is also enhanced by several facets in owls. They have very large ear openings, really that are just lateral and posterior to the eyes. And in many owls, but not all, especially those owls that are long nights, upper latitudes, like a great gray owl and some horned owls and the boreal owl, the ear openings in the skull are offset. And the hypothesis is that helps them triangulate to their sound source with greater resolution, because assuming that the neural synapses fire at the same speed, but if you have a different distance at which the sound hits the head, the belief is that when they hit the brain at different times, the brain is able to triangulate in some format. So this is an added adaptive feature for detecting sound. Facet of biology, of morphology, that helps owls in the kind of lifestyle they lead is that they have their eyes projected forward, which is a predatory facet. Many carnivorous vertebrates have eyes placed forward, but especially that's the case with owls. And these eyes placed forward are also set inside a facial disc, which you should think of functionally acting like a collection device of greater concentration of the sound sources, so that, if you will, they can do just that. They can focus or concentrate the auditory stimuli of moving prey or whatever else it is in the environment that they wish to detect vis-a-vis their sound collection dynamics. Also, owls tend to have feathered tarsi, T-A-R-S-I, which is plural for the tarsa metatarsus, which is the leg. Owls tend to be feathered on their legs, and it's because it's cool at night, and you would lose a lot of you would lose a lot of heat from your legs if it wasn't covered with an insulative, if you will, plumage, which is what is adaptive for owls. There's a couple of exceptions, of course. This owl is a solid owl, by the way, a northern solid owl, and you can see it peering out of a nest cavity. It's worth noting another big distinction between daytime birds of prey and nocturnal ones. Except for short-eared owls and burrowing owls, who are both ground nesting owls, who do have a facet of their natural history that separates them from other owls, in that they will bring nest material to the eventual nest site. No owl builds a nest. So if you see an owl in a tree nest, and you see most owls in in tree cavities, they have not built a nest inside there. The only two exceptions that I am familiar with are short-eared owls and burrowing owls. Short-eared owls nest on the ground, they lay their eggs on the ground, and burrowing owls use what in effect is a ground cavity that was made by those small mammals, prairie dogs, there you go. And burrowing owls will bring nest material inside those cavities. So essentially, not nest builders is the big distinction between daytime birds of prey and nocturnal birds of prey, owls. Now this is a great horned owl, very large owl, and it has a gray squirrel, and that's not typical prey. And the point I want to make is that So many owls are mammalian focused in terms of their diet. And that diet can vary in terms of the size of the mammal, contingent upon the size of the predator, as a decent generalization. But the point I really want to make here with this slide is this. It is true that owls can detect, hunt, forage, and successfully capture prey when it's almost completely blackout with almost no light. Howsoever, they're actually, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they are quite active at crepuscular times, low light conditions. So dusky conditions right before the sun's down or just afterward, and of course before the sun's coming up and just after it has come up. But especially that crepuscular evening time period. So it's not unusual for them to be seen with something that you wouldn't consider to be a nocturnal mammal, because they will hunt in low light conditions right around evening and right around morning. The first family on your bird list is Titanidae under the Strigiformes. And Titanidae, that is close in pronunciation to the genus that is pervasive in this particular family, which is Tyto, Tyto on your list. Tyto alba, this is the common barn owl. This is a medium-sized owl. It is one of the few species of birds on the planet Earth that is known to breed essentially on all continents. There is some disagreement about some of the taxonomic renderings on species, which we're not going to need to worry about because we use the American Ornithologists Union, but I will tell you, there is debate about where to put Tyto alba, or it actually has a different common name, for instance, in various places. Not germane to what we're learning here for identification purpose. Tyto owls tend to have off-white to yellow bills, so that they're not brown, dark brown or black. The bills tend to be oriented downward rather than come out perpendicular from the head. Their facial discs tend to be heart-shaped, and they are very light colored. Now, this bird recently was listed as an imperiled species in the state of Wisconsin, and of course, by default, you can probably pick up, I'm emphasizing on your raptor identification list, birds of prey associated with Wisconsin for what I think are obvious reasons. This is a bird that was probably never common in the state. It was rescinded from the list relatively recently, I don't know exactly what year, which was a good idea. That made a lot of sense because there was no population to recover. There are very few barn owls ever detected breeding in the state of Wisconsin. They do on occasion show up here, but they're a bird far more common out in western and southwestern portions of our contiguous 48 states, and it'd be very rare to find them up into Canada, but they do come up into the southern reaches in western areas. Chocolate brown eyes, medium-sized owl, no feather tufts, heart-shaped facial disc, and now these are puppies, these are youngsters. They have a blue-gray plumage, as you can see here, with a tawny brown or a rusty brown, a very pretty, if you will, collage of coloring on these birds. Barn owls, by the way, are so named because they have been found many times nesting inside barns or inside old abandoned buildings. They are a big-time small mammal hunter, and unlike all of the other owls that you guys learned this semester, this is an owl that can actually vary its clutch size contingent upon food conditions. And when food conditions are rich and there are a lot more small mammals, like when meadow vole populations go up on a cyclic basis, barn owls can respond to coming to those areas where the prey numbers have increased, and they also can increase the number of eggs they lay. This is very unusual because most of the birds of prey we're dealing with cannot do that, and they pay a cost for it. You have to have a trade-off. I said it as you have to, because really that's true. The trade-off for them to have the ability to alter the amount of eggs that they lay is associated with having another liability, because it takes an awful lot of physiological wherewithal to change that reproductive aspect. What do they trade off? Longevity. They have reduced lifespans to have that ability to respond on a short-term basis. Here you can see a group of nestlings, a brood size here of 5 young, and you can see how light colored they are at this just several weeks of age. The next species that I'm dealing with on your list is the northern saw-whet owl, and now we move from the Pteridonidae and we go to the Strigidae. Strigidae owls tend to have, and the ones you're going to have on your list tend to have yellow eyes, and they don't have heart-shaped facial discs as a generalization. And although it's microscopic in size of an anatomical feature, one of the big differences between the Pteridonidae, besides that heart-shaped facial disc and a beak that is slanted more downward rather than perpendicular coming out from the body and the head, is that if you get a close-up on the outside of the hind toe and the talon on the hind toe on a Pteridonid, there's actually some scallop marks along the side of the talon on the rear toe. None of the Strigidae have that. Now you have to have almost a hand lens or a microscope to see that, but that's one of the way taxonomists are able to separate. The northern saw-whet owl is one of our highly migratory owls, because most of the owls that you guys have are not migratory per se. So every fall and spring, these guys head out of northerly latitudes and head south in a broad sweep from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. Northern saw-whet owls are endemic. They are native to North America, that is to say, on a broader scale, to the Western Hemisphere. You might recall I just told you that the barn owl breeds on all continents. And by the way, when I say all continents, it's understood that excludes Antarctica, at least for now, huh? Northern saw-whet owls are a small owl. It's about the size of that screech owl. It's almost the size of your hand. They have no feather tufts. They have yellow eyes. They have a black bill. And they have a brown back, and they have brown and white or light colored underside with streak marks. And it's worth noting that most of the owls tend to be rather camouflaged, and I contend that a lot of them, and most of them are associated with trees and forests, they look like tree bark. They blend in very, very well. And you don't find marked colors. Really, of what use would they be for a nocturnally oriented animal anyway? So, brown back, yellow eyes, no feather tufts, and as you'll see, some streaking on their breast. They have a little white V or chevron here in the forehead region, and they have these little white streak marks coming across their head. My first mentor, Dave Evans, and a lot of the pictures I'm going to show you this semester of Raptor ID/identification makeup really come from Hawk Ridge Nature Reserve up in Duluth, Minnesota, which is my hometown. And so this was from a lot of the work I did with Dave. And if I heard Dave say this once, I heard him say it 100 times. He says, yeah, they're cute, but they're meaner than 700 hells. And as cute as they are, they actually can be very, very aggressive. And I quip sometimes that it's probably the only owl that overwinters down below underground, and you know who his favorite partner would be. It starts with an S and ends with an N. So anyway, I'm joking, of course, but for their cuteness, they are actually a very aggressive for the size owl. And this particular bird does breed in the state of Wisconsin. You can sometimes find them breeding in nest boxes, but most of their nesting occurs in the northern part of the state, and they have, again, massive redistributions in the fall, and then of course, should they survive, heading back up in the spring. They have a very interesting color change, by the way. And when they first come out of the nest, this is unusual, guys, and you'll notice on your list you have responsible for IM or immature versus adult. So think of this as being this is the immature. This only lasts for several weeks. When they come out of the nest, they're this rather chocolate brown to light brown, cinnamon brown on their chest. But in a matter of weeks, they change this body plumage to look like the bird that you just saw previously. They do not molt in that first summer, and when they hatch out, they do not molt their flight feathers. They molt the body plumage. And that is a very unusual physiological aspect of their makeup early in life. Here's a specimen amount of a saw-whet owl, and this bird's plumage is the plumage that will acquire by the end of its first summer, and it will have that plumage for the rest of its life, and it'll molt each summer. But what is also most unusual about saw-whet owls is that they do not molt completely all of their flight feathers, their secondaries and their primaries, each year after that first summer of life, when they grew all their feathers in, if you will, almost all at the same time. That is most unusual about saw-whet owls. In fact, it appears to be a feature of the genus Aegiulus. So for instance, the boreal owl also does likewise. What I contend contextually from a physiological standpoint is that what would drive physiologically a small owl who has very high mass-specific metabolic rates to not go ahead and molt all of its feathers every summer? Birds that size should be able to do that, and yet they do not. And it leads to the question is, what's the trade-off? Why do they hold on to those feathers when one would think their high mass-specific metabolic rates, given their small size, would allow them to do that? So that's a most unusual feature. And by the way, because they do that, and they do it at different spots on their wing in the first couple years of their life, you actually can use the variation of replacement of feathers in the primaries and secondaries as a means to age owls. And some of you probably have been involved with the Wildlife Society, perhaps, catching saw-whet owls. And that aging system that you use, looking at feathers, is an aging system that basically my mentor and I had a part in that to a certain extent. And we published a paper back in the late 1980s that documented that you could actually administer and ascribe an age category because of this most unusual molting construct or dynamic of northern saw-whets. Here's another shot of a fledgling northern saw-whet owl. The white chevron in the forehead is quite obvious here. When they change their plumage, and remember now, it's the body plumage in the first summer of their lives they change. What feathers they grew in their tail and on their forelimb, their primaries and their secondaries, those they hold throughout that first summer. It isn't until the next summer they're going to replace some of them. And this is a big-time small mammal eater. And the next owl on your list is the screech owl. By the way, a very common sound with the previous owl in the summer and also during the fall for northern saw-whet is it's a whistle-like. It's a screech owls have they have a trill. Found in suburban areas, besides rural surroundings. Not quite a deep forest owl like northern saw-whets clearly are relative to this species. These guys can nest in rather park-like conditions. Small owl, about the size of your hand, off-white to yellow bill, yellow eyes, feather tufts, and here in the eastern half of the continent, the eastern screech owl and Megascops aceo. This particular bird is reddish brown and blends in quite well, I might add, with its surroundings. Small mammals, yep, it'll also take insects, I might add, so will the northern saw-whet, so moths, for instance, and other prey that are non-mammalian would include some reptilian makeup also is possible for these birds. In fact, I think the biggest predator that I'm aware of taken by this relatively small is a pigeon, which is a battle I would have liked to have seen. Just can't imagine a screech owl being able to take a pigeon. Not so long ago, there were screech owls were referred to as being either eastern or western, but it was the same species, just two color forms, but they were separated. Where you'd have the gray ones were in the west, and the reddish ones were in the eastern part of the contiguous 48 states. And they're right here in Wisconsin was an area of overlap to a certain extent. You could have both colors. And a ex-student of mine who took this rapid ecology course several decades ago, went on to be a prominent molecular scientist in avian biology, and he was the one who's responsible now for changing the names. This is now a different species than this. So we have a western screech owl, we have an eastern screech owl. And Dr. Glenn Proudfoot, FYI, you don't need to know that name, but he's a Poynter alum. Yay, Pointers! He's the one responsible for molecularly showing that these guys are actually separate species. So again, here's the eastern screech on the left side, Megascops acia. The next species on your list is a boreal owl. Now, this particular owl is known as is holarctically distributed. So it's not endemic just to North America. In fact, the screech owl is endemic, the eastern screech owl is endemic to North America, so is the northern saw-whet. Barn owl, if you recall, was, and the term would be cosmopolitan. It breeds on all the continents, once again exclusive of Antarctica. This is a holarctically breeding species. Holarctic is one word, H-O-L-A-R-C-T-I-C. Holarctic means it breeds throughout the upper reaches, if you will, of the northern hemisphere. So you can find it all the way across Eurasia and all the way across North America in typically northerly latitudes. It is called the Tengmalms owl, T-E-N-G-M-A-L-M apostrophe S, Tengmalms owl in Europe. And same species, but a different common name. And in fact, actually, it's a different subspecies. A little bit bigger. Our collection is without a boreal owl. This bird is a little bit bigger than the northern saw-whet owl and is more the size of a screech owl, because a screech owl is just a little bit bigger than the northern saw-whet. Very similar in appearance. It's the same genus. As you guys can see on your list, you have the genus Aegiulus funarius for the boreal owl. It is a darker brown on its back. It has a light colored bill. Northern saw-whet has a dark bill. Boreals have a light colored bill. The white chevron, that Aegiulus feature, very similar between the northern saw-whet and boreal. And instead of little streak marks on a more lighter brown head as on the northern saw-whet, you have white spots on the head here, joining even right up to where the facial disc, if you will, starts. No feather tufts to speak of, so here's an exception, as was the northern saw-whet, because these are forest owls, and I assured you that there's a number of exceptions. In fact, our list is rich with several of them. White spots, dark brown on their back. We had light spots and white flecking on the northern saw-whet, but a much lighter brown. The chest looks very similar to that of a northern saw-whet owl, who it's closely related to, but much darker streak marks. This is not a bird that's known to breed to any extent in northern Wisconsin. You really have to go, here in the Midwest, you'd have to go to northern Minnesota to find boreal owls. And once again, a big, small mammal eater. This is another look at a boreal owl. You can see the white chevron if you look closely. Again, this is a darker bird, and I've got some comparison shots coming up. So the boreal is bigger, The boreal is on the right-hand side, and the saw-whet is on the left-hand side. So here you get a good look at the disparity in their overall size of these two species. If you turn them around, the boreal owl, of course, is on the left, and I want to highlight. Notice the light-colored beak on the boreal owl and the dark bill on the saw-whet. Some people say the sweat. Both have yellow eyes. They lack feather tufts, and of course that light-colored bill. Otherwise, they look very similar. By the way, these owls do, when they try to camouflage themselves up, again, slit their eyes and bring their feathers in when they're seen, they actually can elevate the feathers right on the top of their head a bit. It's almost like they're, and they get them up just a little bit. It's kind of cute, actually, when they do that. But they don't have the elongated feathers that we see in some of the other owls. The next species on your list is the northern hawk owl. Our collection is without one of these, so I would dearly enjoy it if one of you guys would bring one of these things in someday. Northern hawk owls are an exception in a variety of ways, but probably the big one is this. Besides having a relatively long tail, and they are adapted to nesting in forest conditions, and this is an owl that breeds across the whole Arctic, again, like the boreal. The northern hawk owl is more nocturnal, excuse me, I misspoke, forgive me, is more diurnal in its behavior and activity patterns. And it does catch small mammals, but it will catch ducks, and is capable of catching some grouse, for instance, and other birds. And that long tail probably gives them some agility for chasing things as they fly through relatively thick conditions of habitat. This bird has no feather tufts. It has yellow eyes. It has a yellow bill, not off-white. It's really a yellow bill, and it has a marked regimentation of barring on its ventrum, on its underside. This particular owl gets the genus species Cernia ulula, and it's kind of a tongue twister to pronounce that. And this is also an owl that would be very rare to be breeding in the state of Wisconsin, but in some years, when snow is really thick and they have a hard time catching prey that is subnivean, that is under the surface of the snow, they move down into Wisconsin. And you can find them even into Portage County, but usually the upper third of the state during winter when snow's really thick and they have a hard time getting their prey. They're actually a relatively tame owl, and that's true of actually several of the owl species. This is a close-up of a northern hawk owl. Here's the regimentation, if you will, on the chest. Notice the long tail emanating from the fingers on this researcher. Yellow bill, yellow eyes. Look at the white spots on the head, and I've often thought that the head is rather almost rectangular in size. It's not so much of a rounded facial disc. And I call them sideburns. They have these very thick markings on the margin, laterally speaking, the outer portions of their facial disc. You don't have another owl that you have to know that for this class that has such patterns in the makeup of the suite of characteristics I just covered. This owl, in fact, this particular owl, I was present for. In fact, I took this picture. I went up to Duluth because there was an invasion. There was quite a few northern hawk owls around, and my first mentor, Dave Evans, says, hey, if you come up this weekend, there's several northern hawk owls right inside the town of Duluth, and we can probably go out and catch them quite easily. And we jumped in a van and we drove out to the east side of town, and sure enough, there was a northern hawk owl on the corner of 4th and Lakewood. I forget what street it actually was. He's sitting on the top, and they typically do this right in the top of a tree, daytime hunter. And the guys jumped out of the van. We had AC/DC blasting away, of course. And they grabbed a mouse, they threw it out on the snow, and they said, no, watch, he'll be on his way here any second. And even before those words left his mouth, here comes a northern hawk owl streaming right for us, music blaring away, hard rock, which I like, and that owl attacked the mouse before it was able to escape within about 6-7 feet of our van. And this guy here, Jim, was standing there with a muskie net for scooping up a fish. And he just put the net right over the owl within just right at his base of his body, right at his feet. I could not believe it. They can be very easy to catch. It's almost as if when they see a prey animal, like a small animal that typically would go under the snow, the moment they see it, their trigger goes on and they catch it before it's gone. And they avoid even being influenced by any other stimuli, even a Hall of Fame, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame music group. Here's a close-up of a northern hawk owl. Look at how squared or rectangular the head looks. That is most unusual for any of the strigiformes. The next species is a long-eared owl. This is a picture a good friend of mine, Dr. Bob Murphy, took. And remember now, owls don't build their own nests. There are some 2 owls that are associated with ground, like a burrowing owl who's not on your list, and short-eared owl who's coming up, that will bring nest material nonetheless. In fact, burrowing owls will bring dung, and they will line the outer reaches, if you will, of their cavity. This is an old broadwing hawk nest, and here's a long-eared owl, it's a female, and she's incubating, and she's trying to hide from me, so she's elevated her feather tufts. Incidentally, there is no evidence to suggest that feather tufts on the top of the head receive any sound that are associated with detection of sound. So again, for camouflage and display purposes, aggression and mating is what those are for. Obviously, she has yellow eyes. This is an owl that was only about 18 feet above the ground, and on a very windy day, she couldn't hear me quite as well. I actually spiked up the tree very, very quietly as I inserted the spur on my climbing irons, and I actually was able to hand grab her before she was able to escape. I'm surprised the heck out of her. She had about 5 or 6 eggs, as I recall. This owl, like the northern hawk owl and the boreal owl, is holarctic in its distribution. And this is the quintessential medium-sized owl. And I need to highlight, and you guys need to make sure that you are aware of this. When students miss owl questions, yes, the taxonomy sometimes flips them up. But in terms of recognizing an owl, it 9 times out of 10 will be a confusion between a long-eared owl and a great horned owl. They look very similar. They have orange facial discs, they both have yellow eyes, they have black bills, and they have feather tufts. Long-eared owl feather tufts tend to be more medially placed on the head. They're closer to the center of the top of the head. Horned owls, they're farther off to the side. This is the long-eared owl. They are quite svelte or streamlined in their build, more so than great horned owls, although that's a relative feature, it can be hard to tell. And I have to tell you this, long-eared owls and short-eared owls, who are almost identical in size. Short-ears are a ground nesting grassland species. This is a forest species. Long-eared owls and short-eared owls are incredibly low wing loaded. That means the proportion of the mass they're carrying relative to the surface area of the wing is favored towards the surface area of the wing. They have far more area of wing than they are in terms of the weight of their body, which makes them, translation for functional purposes, buoyant. They fly as light as a butterfly. They can turn on the proverbial dime, and they have a really interesting alarm call, which if you had me for ornithology, or you might, I'll probably invoke this again, but the first time I ever caught a long-eared owl, and I've caught quite a few of these guys, but I'll never forget the first time, because when I reached into the mist net to extricate it out of the net, it gave an alarm call, which is it's a scream, and it scared the bejeebers out of me, and it probably had the consequence of what was intended to do adaptively. I let go of it. Fortunately, it was in the mist net and didn't escape. But it scared me, so it startled me to such, and I suspect that maybe in the wild, that might be an adaptive feature. I don't know, I'm speculating. Nonetheless, it was a startling moment. This bird does respond, as several owls do, to increases in mammal populations, especially meadow voles, and for that matter, of course, forest small mammals like redback voles. Very camouflaged gray-brown plumage. That head is almost identical to that of a great horned owl, except for one obvious thing. Horned owls have a white bow tie, and long-eared owls do not. Also, great horned owls have far more regimented barring on their ventrum. This guy has some barring. Barring is always horizontal, not vertical. Barring is east-west. Streaking is north-south. And you will see some barring on a long-eared owl and some streaking, but the barring is nowhere near as dense as on a great horned owl. Here's a look at a long-eared owl. Here in Wisconsin, by the way, it's not uncommon to find these guys in communal roosting places where there might be a dozen or 15 of these owls are aggregated in a place maybe not much bigger than the size of this classroom. This is CNR 457 here up on the 4th floor. And why they do that? Unknown. Speculation. Probably a really good place to hide. Real thick vegetation, if you will, and it attracts a number of them who similarly view that spot as a good place to be sleeping during the day. There is some barring here. There is some streaking. No white bow tie like on a great horned owl, right? Orange facial disc, yellow eyes, black bill. Medium-sized owl, and typically a tree nesting owl. The genus species for the long-eared owl is Asiootis, as you can see on your list. And the next species on your list, short-eared owl, is Asioflammeus, or Flammeus, however you wish to pronounce it, envelope or envelope. This is also a medium-sized owl. It nests on the ground. And as I've said before, we'll actually bring in some grass material to help construct, if you will, the place where they're going to lay their eggs. This owl is quite light-colored on the underside. It has yellow eyes. It has a dark bill, and as you'll see in the next slide, again, there are no ears. They're feather tufts, but they're really they're really small, and that's why they call them short-eared owls. There's always vertical streaking on them, and this bird, as we'll talk a little bit more in the lecture module for migration, is a true nomad. These guys are found at unpredictable times, probably responding to prey conditions, all over the world. I've even seen short-eared owl while I was hiking, working in Greenland, working on peregrine falcons. And this owl is a typical small mammal eater. And where we work in Greenland, there are no small mammals. There are no voles, there are no mice. So this guy either got blown out on a storm to that area, or it was on its way to some other place, and or, of course, catching some birds, small birds, songbirds that exist in Greenland. In a place in Greenland where I do my work. Here's a nice comparative shot, lucky us. Again, from all the years I've spent at Hawk Ridge. So here's a long-eared owl, no white bow tie, medium-sized owl. There's a short-eared owl. You should note, much lighter color. Here are primaries, here are secondaries. Look at how much barring you typically find in a forest owl, probably associated with all the surrounding lines and branches, if you will, that helps them blend in with such. This is more, again, this is a grassland species, wherever it is found in the world. Much less barring underneath here. Here's the streaking I told you about. And I've always thought that short-eared owls tend to have a very light-colored face and very, very light-colored in the inside. Yes, yes, yes. Long-eared owls have some light coloring in here, but they don't have an orange facial disc. They're lighter. In fact, it makes the rings around the eye look like black eyes, like they got in a fight or something like that. Even though there are dark rings about a long-eared owl's eyes, they seem to stand out more because of the lightness in the center of the face of a short-eared owl. These crescent markings give you hyphen, diddle, squat, absolutely nothing for identification. red-tailed hawk, all kinds of birds of prey have these kinds of markings, if you will. Do not rely upon them for any such thing, even though you might see those and you go, oh boy, what's that all about? Nothing. From the standpoint of separating species, that won't give you a darn thing. So here's the dorsal side of these two species. Here's the long-eared owl, and here's the short-eared owl, and a much lighter color and a much grayer brown back on the long-eared owl, and a much lighter brown coloration on the short-eared owl. And the short-eared owls, feather tufts are basically right in here, and these are the things they elevate to some extent when they're involved in display purposes, and also perhaps for some camouflage to a certain extent. Again, short-eared owls are a ground nester, and long-eared owls are tree nesters. Short-eared owls are in trouble in North America. There is strong evidence to suggest that numbers have declined, and we're not exactly sure. I could speculate for longer than I need to because it would be speculation. May be related to the general principle that because it's a grassland nesting bird and conversion of agricultural lands to monoculture and things associated with anthropogenic use, that this is a bird that faces a liability as a consequence of such. It is a bird, by the way, as a species that will show up from time to time on the Buena Vista Marsh just southwest of town, about 15-20 minutes from here. And they have a rather diurnal component to their according behavior. They are very low wing loaded, and you up, down, around, and you fly like butterflies because they are so low wing loaded. So you could typically be able to see these guys in courtship antics, which are spectacular in late afternoon. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? Of course, this is Strix varia. This is the barred owl. It's named because it has barring. And barring is horizontal, east to west, if you will. And it's all across the back and into the tail. It has, and even though it's a forest owl, it lacks feather tufts. It has chocolate brown eyes. It has a yellow bill. Take note. The facial disc is gray, light gray. And there are concentric rings in that facial disc. The great gray owl coming up, is it last or second to last? The great gray owl also has concentric rings. The great gray owl, howsoever, and also has a yellow bill, but the great gray owl has yellow eyes. And of course, the great gray owl isn't going to have this barring that we see here. Some claim that this is a swamp specialist, so bottom wet woodland landscapes like along riverine settings, like here along Stevens Point. But take my word for it, they're quite flexible. They can breed in many upland sites. Tree cavities are the preferred setup. And remember, they don't build a nest themselves, so they'd be using a hole from natural falling of a limb that creates a portal into a stem, or a pileated woodpecker that gouges out an opening, maybe nested there, and they usurp it in a different year. And in fact, there's always a pair on the western side of Schmeeckley Reserve, kind of just east of Rocky Rococo's Pizza. Just about every year they've been breeding in there. And they're very faithful, as is true for many raptors, to certain territories, either by individuals or as a species. Concentric rings, dark gray in the facial disc, yellow bill, chocolate brown eyes. You had two owls with brown eyes. And both of their common names, or part of it, begin with the letter B. So does the word brown. So barn owls, brown eyes. Barred owls, brown eyes. Barring on the back. But they have an unusual construct as Strix varia to the underside of their body in terms of streaking or barring. In fact, they have both. Yellow bill, concentric rings in the facial disc, which is gray colored, brown eyes, yellow bill. They have barring in the upper quarter or third of the ventrum or the underside of the bird's body, and then they have streaking underneath. That is most unusual. This owl, when the European colonists arrived on the eastern shoreline of this hemisphere, they encountered, of course, barred owls, and they were spread across the forested regions out into really the Mississippi River Valley, and they were not found west of there. They are now increasing in number in the western portion of the continent, and they moved across the prairies, which apparently were a barrier. And that barrier was lacking of forested habitat, and people like to have trees, and we planted a bunch of trees, and we didn't allow fire to keep the prairie in a grassland setting, get agricultural conversions. We've changed the landscape greatly. The speculation, which seems reasonable, is that once they had enough trees in the central part of the continent where the prairies existed, and some still are there, then you created habitat for them to skip along and head west, which they have done. And because they're flexible in terms of kinds of forested habitat and the kinds of diet, they have taken hold, and they are increasing in numbers in Oregon and California and Washington, to the detriment of the endangered species listed threatened race of the northern spotted owl. So, and in fact, this species now interbreeds successfully, creates hybridization offspring, hybrid offspring that can crossbreed with either parental species. So this is a fascinating time for perhaps something that could be in accord with speciation dynamics. But at any rate, some don't look at it so favorably as an exciting dynamic. They look at it as a problem for the viability of northern spotted owls, because northern spotted owls get out-competed for habitat by barred owls. They're more restricted, our northern spotted owls for food. They only take certain kinds of food, and they only nest in certain kinds of places. Barred owls are very Catholic in their diet, which means they're broad, they're very aggressive, and they can exclude, when they so choose, northern spotted owls from territories, and they can usurp them to such an extent that the U.S. Foresters invoked a rather austere, aggressive management plan, where they got permits to shoot barred owls, which is a native species here in North America, shoot barred owls in areas where they wanted to make sure that northern spotted owls remain as a viable species, as, if you will, entertained for management efforts as an extension of the Endangered Species Act. So close-up of a barred owl face. No feather tufts. Here's another exception, even though it's a forest owl. And the next species is the great gray owl. Great gray owls are found holarctically. It's a different subspecies across Eurasia. It's the same species, of course. We have Strix nebulosa. And in fact, here in the Western Hemisphere, the upper reaches, because it's in North America as a continent, it actually is Strix nebulosa nebulosa. In Eurasia, it's Strix nebulosa laponicus, as I recall. Don't worry about the subspecies designation. You guys are responsible for Strix nebulosa. This is a massive owl. It is, of all of the world's owls, the longest in overall length, and it has proportionately the biggest head of any owl. It doesn't weigh the most, though. The heaviest owls really are in the genus Bubo, like the Harry Potter owl, which is a Eurasian eagle owl, or even some great horned owls, and even some snowy owls weigh more than great grays. So these guys are a little lighter. They're still big, and they have proportionally one of the longest tails you will find in all of strigiforms. This is a very interesting owl by virtue of some of the things I've said, and some other features. They have this predominant gray color. They have a yellow bill. They have yellow eyes. And like Strix varia, the barred owl, which is an endemic, of course, to North America, it has concentric gray rings in the facial disc. Yellow bill, white bow tie, concentric rings. Here's another exception. It's a forest owl. No feather tufts. Small mammals. Here you have a marked disparity in size between the predator and prey. It's kind of unusual, especially when you're dealing with agile carnivores such as the raptors. Redback voles, meadow voles, those are very common features of their diet, and they are rather sedentary year-round, except when snow conditions become tough, like for instance, as Ford discussed with the northern hawk owl, they will move southward, and they go to areas where the snow is of, if you will, reduced depth, and so they can have better access to their subnivean, below the surface of the snow, their subnivean prey, small mammals, which they can detect. They have this massive head, which allows placement of massively, relative to other owls, very large ear openings, and a very large facial disc, which helps them gather sound, if you will. This owl has the ability, because it's so big and heavy enough, it can actually break through crusted snow in the spring. We have warming temperatures during the day, and during night they freeze again. It creates a crust, which would make, for many species that needed to get through to their owl prey, make them relatively inaccessible. That's probably one of the reasons northern saw-whet owls have to migrate during the wintertime, stay out of those northern latitudes. They can crash through and have very long legs, and they can reach prey, evidence to suggest that they can hear it and reach it 2 feet beneath the surface of the snow. The world's overall longest in length owl, and the specimen I just showed you is the consequence of the winter of, that would have been 2007 and 2008. Apparently the spring before was a horrible, wet, cold spring, at least that's the speculation, and small mammal populations perhaps plummeted, and we had this massive eruption, not migration, but eruption or movement of owls southward. And great gray owls even occurred in big numbers, relatively speaking, here in Portage County. I would see them on my morning runs on telephone poles, and they were starving. They were, in fact, beyond the point of no return. So if you caught one, and they were easy to catch because they were starving, and you could, like with that northern hawk owl, just throw a mouse out. You could put on the end of a fishing line and throw out a small mammal carcass of a study skin, and you could reel in a great gray owl in some instances. And when you caught that owl and you felt its chest, the breastbone would stick out strikingly so. And because the bird was using its last reserves of food, it was breaking down the glycogen and carbohydrates in the chest region. And once a bird starts breaking down that reserve, they are in trouble. You could shove a bunch of mice in their mouth and they would still die because they've just gone beyond the point of no return. I mentioned some of these dynamics in my lecture module of reverse size dimorphism and fat scores, etc. So once again, we didn't have any mounts in this collection at UWSP until that winter. And it's because a lot of starving birds were found. And so we were lucky enough to get some of those carcasses. Too bad for the owls, of course, but good for us. Can you imagine the massive bottleneck of genetic change that must happen when so many of those individuals of that particular or those populations in northern North America pass on, and who's left afterward? Wouldn't that be a fascinating area for population ecology from a genetic standpoint? Great gray owls, again, use nests that are built by other species. This forest owl will use a raven nest or an old goshawk nest, or they will use a tree that is felled like this and use the portal that's remaining after, for instance, like a wind breakage or a lightning strike. They do nest in the state of Wisconsin for many decades in the last century, latter part of the last century. Many natural historians and birders in Wisconsin thought, no, they probably don't breed in Wisconsin, no one's seen any. But the late Don Follen, F-O-L-L-E-N, FYI, you don't need to keep track of his name, F-O-L-L-E-N. Don Follen was one of those people who believed fervently that, no, there's great gray owls. I think I've heard them in the northern part of the state. And sure enough, he kept at it, and he was able to find them in some spruce tamarack, black spruce and tamarack bogs in northern Wisconsin. In fact, a couple of people, as I recall, put up some platforms in some of those areas and put some sticks in there, and they were actually able to attract great gray owls. But very rare to occur as a breeding bird in the state of Wisconsin. You really need to go farther north in the border forest, or head farther south latitudinally, but head higher up elevationally in montane boreal forest, for instance, in the Rocky Mountains, and then you can find them also. No feather tufts, yellow eyes, concentric rings, yellow beak. Why are heads so big on owls? To accommodate big ear openings and some of the largest eyes, relatively speaking, in all of kingdom Animalia. They are tubular, they are elongated. Owls tend not to see color, and their eyes have evolved to be very sensitive to movement. Daytime birds of prey have eyes that are adapted for picking up color and being sensitive to such. Owls have a sensitivity to movement, and you can't have both. It's almost an impossible axiom of physiology and anatomy of the construct of a vertebrate eye to be able to do both things. So these guys have traded off high color resolution for sensitivity of movement. And the evidence suggests that most owls, if not all, tend to see black and white and don't need to be able to see color vision, and as such, do not have it. Another feature as to why the eyes of birds are different from, for instance, our eyes, or eyes of mammals, is they have three eyelids. They have a upper eyelid like we do, and we have a lower eyelid, we do. And they also have, and this is general for birds, not just birds of prey, they have a nictitating membrane, a translucent third eyelid that closes over the eye to protect it. These guys are moving at relatively high speeds, and you don't want to have physical trauma associated with striking this. And when they go after prey, I assure you, that nictitating membrane is going to close over the eye. We have a remnant in your eye. It's that little pink nodule that's right in the corner of the medial portion of your eyeball. Of course, we don't need that nictitating membrane. Yeah, it probably helps moisten the eye, but also for protection. So a very important construct of an avian eye, not just raptor, class Aves, this particular feature. And lucky whoever got this shot could see both of those. In the owl video that you guys look at, my gal, Maddie, got a wonderful picture and showed you in slow motion that nictitating membrane closing over across an eyeball of a great horned owl, which is what we're looking at. Yellow eyes, feather tufts farther apart on the head, more laterally placed than medial placement. They have a dark bill, dark beak, and this is one of the world's biggest owls. One of the world's heaviest owls. Here's another, a repeat of a picture I showed you earlier. Orange facial disc, feather tufts on the top of the head, relatively far apart. White bow tie in the neck region under the bill, and marked barring underneath the nerve ventrum. A hallmark of this particular species of owl, which breeds throughout the entire western hemisphere from above the tree line to down to the tip of South America. Great horned owls have a very Catholic diet. This, of course, is a snow event. Just a few more remarks about great horned owls. Because they're so big and they're relatively aggressive, they will take a variety of prey, and they can kill prey that is much bigger than they are. They can't carry it, but in the wintertime, if they kill something bigger than themselves, they can eat part of it and then return to it. And you might think, well, wait a minute, isn't that food going to get frozen? Probably. They can eat to a certain extent some of the frozen food, but they will brood the food, in quotes, brooded. They will sit on it, and they will warm the food up and then tear it apart and eat it, which is a remarkably adaptive feature of great horned owls. And in some years when snows are real deep, sometimes there'll be eruptive movements and when prey numbers are down. Used to be the 10-year cycle where rough grouse and snowshoe hare populations plummeted every 10 years and then increased. When they plummeted, many great horned owls would leave the northern latitudes. In fact, they would stop breeding, and it was really just the adults that would move south. And in fact, when times get tough, horned owls will eat each other. They will be cannibalistic. It's a very aggressive species. When things really go far south on the planet Earth, beetles will probably survive, and great horned owls will be eating them. It's a remarkably adaptive creature and exhibits a marked stretching of its niche. Again, breeding throughout all of South America and most of North America also. This species is a whole Arctic species. This is one of the easiest owls you have in your list for identification. Again, I want to remind you, the two owls that students struggle with for visual identification is to separate a great horn from a lanyard owl. I don't think I've ever seen anyone miss a snowy owl. This is a name change, so if you have a field guide, you might have a different genus, but it's been changed to Buboscandiacus. This is the same genus, of course, as the great horned owl. The snowy molecular evidence especially was responsible for changing the genus of this particular owl. Really, a lot more feathers associated with the legs and the feet because it's an Arctic breeding bird. Lots of feathers. They're actually called, and you don't need to write this down, rictal bristles, which makes it looks like it has a mustache. Black bill, yellow eyes, no feather tufts, nests on the ground, a tundra nesting. Tundra is a French term meaning treeless. And this is also an owl that actually not almost, every year there is an influx of snowy owls from upper latitudes in the Western Hemisphere to just about the upper quarter of the contiguous 48 states, from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. And some of these owls, which my mentor Dave Evans has determined through his multi-decadal winter territorial study of snowy owls in Duluth Superior, they are very tenacious to the same winter territories. And guess who dominates? Males or females? Females do. Females kick the butts of males. If the female wants a certain couple blocks of Superior, Wisconsin, she gets them. And any male or any other bird that tries to get in there, she goes after them. So their size is a big advantage during that time period. This is probably a male, an older male. Some males can be almost completely white. Females tend to have more markings on them than do males, especially in the first year of life. It's a beautiful shot. Of course, you might recognize that avens on the ground, same kind of avens that occurs in prairies, and some people call it when it goes to seed prairie smoke. Beautiful tundra setting here, and this is probably a female. She has more markings on her, and it's almost even hard to see the yellow eyes, if you will, because of the light and whatnot, but I assure you she does. And again, very mustachy looking feature of the circumscribing the beak on this bird. Most young owls are light colored, very light, but white would stick out in the tundra, and just about every wolf, Arctic fox, or some other predator, wolverine, would be able to spot a white owl that would be flightless. So adaptively, they have a different color for their young, especially this gray, this darker color, which allows them to blend into a much greater extent. Having said that, woe be it to any mammalian predator or an avian predator that tries to come here and get these. These guys are very aggressive, and they fly at and they will readily strike someone. I don't know if they're quite as aggressive as some barred owls or horned owls, which are notoriously, they're infamous for how aggressive they are. I've had one friend that lost an eye to a great horned owl. Most people that climb trees to ban great horned owls probably have really good insurance policies. I have a buddy that wears a hockey mask, face mask. He wears a hockey shoulder pads. He's all decked up and ready for battle because these guys can be very, very dangerous. And because they're so heavy, one of the world's heaviest owls, they pack quite a punch, especially, of course, the females. Again, they nest in tundra settings, but many of them will overwinter farther south, even into agricultural settings in the southern half of the state of Wisconsin in some years. That's not that unusual. Easy bird for identification. Very, very difficult to miss this species. This undoubtedly is a first-year female that is headed south, undoubtedly. Barbed wire isn't common in the tundra. And this shows you to the extent how dark females can be. In that first year, look at all the black barring that occurs on them. The face seems to be relatively clean. If she survives for another year, she'll lose some of that dark coloration. She'll always have some barring, and males will tend to lose a lot more. In fact, males are almost never quite this dark in their first year of life. So one might ask why it is, and I've mentioned this probably I hope I've done it a couple times. Why is there's an age-specific difference in plumage? The leading conjecture that's most reasonable is that having different color variation probably might give you some camouflage advantages for some species, but maybe more importantly, or as importantly, it sends a signal to a territorial bird that, oh, it's a kid, it's an inexperienced, naive dope. I don't need to worry about them coming in and trying to usurp the territory. It releases them from having to automatically flag a potential competitor for a territory as such. I'm not a competitor for a territory. Don't pick on me. I don't have the color that indicates that you have to worry about me as potentially competing for the site. It's one of the leading hypotheses as to why young of the year across all of Class 80s probably have different plumages. Of course, there would be other reasons, and there probably isn't just one reason for all species, but that's a good generalization. There's a behavioral trait that is seen in a number of owls. In fact, it's seen in a number of birds. Parrots do this, and there's a number of species of owls where this has been recorded. It's called allopreening, A-L-L-O, preening. Allo, the prefix, means different. In other words, I'm preening or streamlining and putting in place the feathers or the plumage of a different individual. There's the different, that's the allopreening component. Lots of speculation. Why would you alloprene? Why would you take care of another individual? It might be because birds are susceptible to infestations of certain kind of ectothermic insects like fleas, for instance, and some other flies that are associated with plumage that actually can feed on feathers, of all things, and even some of the skin tissue. But it is possible that allopreening evolved in some species to allow them to get at places on their body that they can't reach themselves so readily, and that the allopreening is a means by which another individual would help that individual shed themselves or rid themselves, minimize the extent of any parasitic, if you will, presence. If you're going to do that, evolutionary ecology predicates of logic and investigative studies suggest allopreening should occur in genetically related offspring, kin. If you're going to preen somebody, you're more likely should be preening something that has close association or a close, if you will, genetic makeup like you. Those are hypotheses. We don't know that that's what guides us, but an allopreening construct as shown here in these two great gray owls, it's a fascinating area of social biology. And that will close our look at owls.